Chapter 1. Violet's Letter and the Street that Kept Its Own Counsel. The letter from Miss Violet Peel arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of October, written on the cream notepaper that Violet had used for 40 years, thin, slightly textured, the kind that takes ink cleanly and keeps it permanently, as though the paper itself understood that what was written upon it was meant to last. Miss Jane Marple read it at her breakfast table in Danemead Cottage, with the October light coming grey and damp through the dining-room window, and the village of St Mary Mead conducting itself outside, with the subdued, slightly resigned energy of a community that has accepted that summer is comprehensively finished and winter has not yet committed to arriving, and that the interval between the two is the most disagreeable period in the English calendar. The letter said, in Violet's characteristically precise hand, "My dear Jane, I find myself in the somewhat embarrassing position of writing to ask you to come for a visit without being able to explain to my own satisfaction why I feel the visit is necessary. I have been having difficulty sleeping. I have been, for the past 3 weeks, in a state of what I can only describe as unresolved unease, the kind of feeling one has when one has seen something that one cannot quite account for and has decided, perhaps too hastily, that it was nothing. I live on a quiet street. My neighbours are ordinary people, and yet the street does not feel quiet to me at present, and the neighbours do not feel ordinary. And I find I should very much like the company of someone whose judgment I trust. I am aware this is not a very specific invitation. I offer it anyway. Your affectionate friend, Violet Peel No. 3, Wisteria Row, Chadbourne St Peter, Worcestershire." Miss Marple set the letter down and looked at it for a moment with the patient, unhurried attention she brought to all communications of consequence. Then she looked out the window at the grey October morning and thought about Violet Peel, whom she'd known since they were both 17 at the same school in Bath, and who was one of the least fanciful women of Miss Marple's extensive acquaintance. Violet had been a schoolmistress for 35 years. She had managed classrooms of 30 children with the systematic precision of a military commander and the genuine warmth of a person who actually liked children, which is a rarer combination than is generally supposed. She was not given to unresolved unease. She was not given to writing letters she could not explain. She had written this one. Miss Marple wrote her acceptance before lunch, and was on the Wednesday morning train to Chadbourne St Peter 3 days later, her portmanteau in the luggage van and her knitting in her bag and the particular quality of alert, comfortable attention in her expression that she always carried when she was going somewhere that had been described to her as quiet and ordinary, and in which she therefore expected to find, on closer examination, the opposite. Yet Wisteria Row was a street of 7 Victorian houses set back from the road behind short front gardens, and separated from each other by privet hedges of considerable age and authority. The kind of hedge that has been growing for 30 years and has arrived at a height that communicates, without requiring words, an absolute commitment to the principle that what happens on one side of it is not the business of anything on the other side. The houses themselves were solid, unpretentious, the brickwork darkened pleasantly by decades of Worcestershire weather. The street had the appearance of a place where nothing of significance ever happened. Miss Marple had always found that particular appearance the most interesting. Violet Peel met her at the door of No. 3 with the warm, slightly relieved urgency of a woman who's been waiting for reinforcement and is glad it has arrived. She was 67, small and precise, with the upright bearing of a woman who had spent 40 years telling children to sit up straight and had applied the instruction to herself throughout. She had the eyes of a person accustomed to comprehensive observation, the schoolmistress's perpetual awareness of an entire room simultaneously, and they held, at present, a quality of contained anxiety that she was managing with considerable skill but not entirely concealing. "I'm very glad you came," she said, taking Miss Marple's coat. "I know the letter was vague." "Not vague," Miss Marple said. "Careful, there is a difference. You told me precisely what you could tell me, which was that something was wrong and that you had seen something you could not account for. That is not vague, that is honest." Violet looked at her with the expression of a woman receiving permission for something she had not quite known she needed permission for. "Come and have tea," she said. "I'll tell you about it properly." She told her about it over tea in the sitting-room, with the October afternoon rain beginning against the windows and the fire burning with the settled competence of a fire in a house where it has been lit regularly for 22 years. She told it in the careful, sequential manner of a former schoolmistress presenting facts. What she had seen, when she had seen it, from which window, at what time, and what she'd subsequently told herself about it. The figure crossing from number 4 to number 5 at 11:30 on a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago. Over the back garden wall, into the number 5 garden, 20 minutes. Back the same way. "And you recognised the figure?" Miss Marple said. Violet's hands were still around her teacup. "I believe so," she said. The light from the kitchen window at number 5 was on. There was enough. She paused. "I told myself I was mistaken. I told myself it was probably innocent. I told myself it was not my business." "And then you wrote to me," Miss Marple said. "And then I wrote to you," Violet agreed. 4 days after, because I could not sleep and I could not stop thinking about it, and I did not know who else to tell." "Who was it?" Miss Marple asked. "Mr. Gale," Violet said. "From number 4, Francis Gale." "He is a solicitor in the town," Miss Marple nodded slowly. She said nothing further about this, but she set it in the careful, orderly internal arrangement of things she was collecting, in the place where things that matter are kept until they are needed, and she asked Violet to tell her about each of the neighbours in turn, and she listened with the total, comprehensive attention that she had been bringing to the stories of the people around her since she was a very young woman, and she thought, as she listened, about what it means when a solicitor crosses his neighbour's garden wall at 11:30 at night and stays for 20 minutes and crosses back. By the time the tea was finished and the fire had burned down an hour's worth, she had a framework. It was not yet a complete picture, but it had the shape of one, and she had always found that the shape was the most important part, that once the shape was clear, the details arranged themselves into it, with the inevitability of water finding its level. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept well, which was her customary practice in places where other people were not sleeping well at all. Chapter 2. The Street Observed, and a Man in His Greenhouse. Thursday and Friday were days of observation, which were Miss Marple's most productive days in any investigation, because observation is the kind of work that looks like nothing and accomplishes everything, and Miss Marple had perfected the art of looking like a pleasant elderly lady, taking a gentle interest in her surroundings to the degree that no one she observed ever had any sense of being observed at all. She walked the length of Wisteria Row on Thursday morning in both directions, at the unhurried pace of a woman taking the air, and she looked at each house with the apparently casual interest of a visitor, familiarising herself with new surroundings, and she filed what she saw. Number 1 was a tidy house with net curtains and a garden of mathematical precision, the garden of a person for whom order is a moral position. Number 2 had the slightly distracted quality of a professional man's house, the garden competent but secondary to other concerns, the curtains slightly irregular in their arrangement, as though hung by someone who would rather be doing something else. Number 2 was Dr. Forrest's house. She noted the arrangement of the curtains and the quality of the distraction, and moved on. For number 4, the Gales' house, was the most prosperous looking on the street. It had been recently painted. The front garden had been professionally landscaped, which was unusual on a street whose other residents maintained their own. The curtains were new and of good quality. Miss Marple noted the prosperity with the specific interest she always brought to prosperity, whose source was not immediately apparent, and moved on. Number 5 was the Adburys. It had a warm, slightly worn quality, the warmth of a house in which ordinary life has been lived for 11 years without excessive attention to appearance. The front garden had roses, still bearing a few late October blooms, the roses of a person who genuinely loved them, rather than a person who kept them for effect. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the house with the attentive stillness of a woman seeing something, and then she walked on. She met the residents in the accumulative natural way of a visitor being introduced by a mutual friend. Violet knew everyone, as a 22-year resident must, and she moved through the social geography of the street with the ease of long familiarity, and Miss Marple moved with her, and looked, and listened, and remembered. She met Mrs. Dorothea Adbury at the gate of number 5 on Thursday afternoon, a handsome woman of 56, composed in the manner of a woman who has been composed through difficult things for a long time, and has the posture to prove it. She greeted Miss Marple with the pleasant, careful warmth of a person performing social interaction correctly and slightly distantly, and her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, had in them the quality that Miss Marple had learned over many decades to identify with precision. The particular exhausted alertness of a person who is afraid of something and has been afraid of it for long enough that the fear has become indistinguishable from their ordinary expression. She met Francis Gale at his gate on Thursday evening. 44, smooth-haired, with the practised ease of a man whose profession has taught him to be pleasant to people he is managing, and whose manner with Miss Marple was precisely that. Pleasant, attentive, and entirely controlled. He shook her hand with the correct warmth, said the correct things about Violet Street being a charming part of Chadbourne, and directed at her a smile that reached all the appropriate distances and no further. She met Dr. Forrest on Friday morning when he passed them on the pavement, 52, thin-faced, with the compressed inward quality of a man managing something internal with considerable effort. He was polite. He was correct. He did not meet Miss Marple's eyes for more than a second, which was not enough to identify in itself, but which, combined with everything else, was worth noting. She met Miss Eleanor Brid on Friday afternoon at the gate of number 6, where Miss Brid was conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive assessment of her front garden's winter preparation, with the focused satisfaction of a woman engaged in work she knows well. Eleanor Brid was 71, partially deaf, apparently absorbed entirely in her garden and her cat and her own affairs. And actually, this Miss Marple understood within 10 minutes of conversation, the most extensively informed person on Wisteria Row. She knew everything about everyone, in the comprehensive, patient way of a person who has lived on the same street for 30 years and has had nothing to obstruct her observation but her own discretion. She was, Miss Marple determined, exercising that discretion at present. "You have lived here a long time," Miss Marple said, at one point in their conversation. 31 years, Miss Brid said. "Since before any of them." She indicated the street with a slight movement of her garden fork. "I knew this row when it was a different kind of place. Quieter," she paused, "though it was not necessarily less interesting." "And now?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. Miss Brid looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who has decided whether to trust someone and has arrived at a provisional yes. "Now," she said carefully, "it is a street on which things are happening that the street does not acknowledge, which is not unusual. Streets generally don't." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "they generally don't." She spent Saturday morning at Violet's cottage, knitting and waiting. She was very good at waiting. It was, she had always found, one of the most undervalued professional capacities, the ability to be entirely still and entirely ready simultaneously, to exist in a state of patient, attentive suspension until the thing one is waiting for arrives. At 9:30 on Saturday morning, she heard from across the street and 2 houses down a sound that was not a scream, but was the immediate precursor to one, the sharp, an involuntary exhalation of a woman who has opened a door and found something she was not prepared to find. Miss Marple set down her knitting, put on her coat, and went out. Chapter 3. The Greenhouse, and What the Doctor Did Not Notice. The body of Clement Adbury was in his greenhouse at the bottom of the number 5 garden, in the wooden chair he kept there for his afternoon reading, in the attitude of a man who had simply and completely stopped. He was 58, with the settled, substantial look of a man who had spent 30 years in the steady professional world of banking, and had carried that steadiness into retirement. He was dressed in his ordinary morning clothes, not the garden coat, not the working clothes of a man who had been planning outdoor work, but the indoor clothes of a man who had gone to his greenhouse for reading and tea and the company of his roses. His pipe was in his right hand, loaded and barely smoked. His book was open on his lap at page 47. His face wore the composed expression of a man in whom all the ordinary business of living has simply ceased. Dr. Forrest arrived within 5 minutes. He had been, Mrs. Adbury told Violet in a shaking voice, already on his way down the path to call on Clement when she found him, which was why he arrived so quickly. He conducted his examination with the practised efficiency of a physician of long experience, and he straightened up and said, in the measured, sympathetic voice of a man performing a familiar professional duty, that it was the heart, as they had always known it might be, that Clement had gone quietly and without pain, and that Mrs. Adbury should go inside and have something warm. Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the greenhouse throughout this examination and said nothing. She was looking at Dr. Forrest, and at the body, and at the pipe, and at the book, and at the floor near the base of the wooden chair. The floor near the base of the chair had in its near corner a small dark patch, not large, not immediately obvious, but present. The smell in the greenhouse was the normal smell of glass and earth and roses and the faint sweet residue of tobacco, and beneath it, very faint and very sweet in a different way, something else. Something that Miss Marple had encountered once before, years ago, in a different context, and which she placed now with the quiet, uncertain efficiency of a woman with a very good memory. She said nothing to anyone except Inspector Stamp, whom she told on Saturday afternoon, and she told him specifically and precisely, in the manner of a woman who understands that specific and precise information is significantly more useful than general suggestion. "The floor near the base of the chair," she said. "There is a small spilled quantity of liquid, sweet-smelling, not tea, not anything the greenhouse would produce naturally. It was present at 9:45 this morning and will be significantly less present by this afternoon, and substantially gone by tomorrow. I would suggest, if the inspector is willing, that a sample be taken today." Inspector Ronald Stamp looked at her with the politely resistant scepticism she had expected and was entirely accustomed to. And then he looked at Violet Peel, who gave him the steady, unambiguous gaze of a former schoolmistress confirming that the person he is sceptical of is worth listening to. And he took the sample. He also noted, at Miss Marple's suggestion, that the pipe had been loaded and barely smoked, 3 draws at most, in a man known for his afternoon pipe who would normally have smoked it down to the bowl, and that the book was open at page 47, which was the same page it had been on the previous Tuesday when Mrs. Adbury had brought Clement his tea in the greenhouse, and had noticed in passing the page number, because it was the same as her own age. A man who reads in his greenhouse on a Saturday morning does not stop at the same page he was on 4 days earlier, unless something has prevented him from reading. A man who has been given something in a drink before he comes to his greenhouse reads 3 draws of his pipe and 4 days' worth of nothing, and stops. Miss Marple went home to Violet's for lunch, and waited for Saturday afternoon to produce what Saturday afternoons in situations of this kind reliably produced: the first small failures of composure in the people who had been composing themselves since 9:30 in the morning. Chapter 4. Francis Gale arrives. Too soon, and Miss Eleanor Brid speaks. Francis Gale arrived at number 5 at 10:10 on Saturday morning, 20 minutes after the body was found, before anyone on Wisteria Row had been formally notified, before the constable who had been summoned by Mrs. Adbury had arrived. He arrived with the concerned, solicitous urgency of a man who has just heard terrible news and has come immediately to help. Miss Marple, standing at the gate of number 3 with Violet, watched him go in. She noted the time. She noted the quality of his urgency, the specifically calibrated urgency of a man who knows he needs to be inside that house quickly and has found the appropriate expression for arriving there. "How did he know?" Violet asked in a low voice. "He didn't hear it from Mrs. Adbury," Miss Marple said. "She went directly from finding the body to telephoning the constable and then to Violet's door. She spoke to no one on the street, and the constable has not yet arrived." "Then someone told him," Violet said. "Someone told him," Miss Marple agreed, "or he was waiting to be told. Which implies he already knew that something would happen this morning that required him to be in that house quickly." She said this quietly, and she said it only to Violet, and she filed it in the place where it belonged, and went back inside for her knitting and waited. At 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, when the constable had come and gone, and the doctor had come and gone again, and the street had settled into the heavy, suspended quiet of a place where something has happened, and the full weight of it has not yet arrived, Miss Marple went to call on Miss Eleanor Brid. She found her, as she had expected, in the sitting room of number 6 with her cat on her lap, and the wireless playing softly in the corner, and she accepted the cup of tea that Miss Brid offered with the immediate, impractised hospitality of a woman who has been expecting a visit of this kind. "You're going to ask me what I know," Miss Brid said, with the direct simplicity of a woman whose age has relieved her of the obligation to approach things obliquely. "I am," Miss Marple agreed, "if you're willing to tell me." Miss Brid looked at her for a moment, the comprehensive assessing look that Miss Marple had observed in the garden the previous afternoon. "I've been sitting here all morning," Miss Brid said, "wondering whether to telephone someone. I don't know who one telephones in a situation like this. I don't know that it's my business." She paused. "Though I find that people who say something is not their business are generally using that phrase to mean it is too alarming to be their business, rather than too trivial." "Yes," Miss Marple said. That is generally correct. Miss Brid scratched the cat's ear in a meditative way and said, I have lived on this street for 31 years. I know what happens on it and what does not. What does not happen on it is a doctor's motor outside number 5 on a Thursday afternoon. Hugh Forrest lives at number 2. He does not make house calls in the normal way. He has a surgery for that. But he came to see Clement Adbury on Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and he was there for 15 minutes. And when he left, he had his medical bag, which he had also brought when he arrived. You saw this, Miss Marple said. I was in my front garden, Miss Brid said. I was pruning the roses. I notice a great many things when I am pruning roses, she paused. And I know about the letters. Miss Marple was very still. Tell me about the letters, she said. Clement Adbury wrote letters in August, Miss Brid said. I know this because I saw him post them, 3 of them, at the postbox on the corner, on a Thursday morning in August. He had an expression that I have seen before, in people who have made a difficult decision and are executing it before they can change their minds, she paused. I also know, because I have 31 years of observing this street, that within a fortnight of those letters being posted, 3 of Clement's neighbours began to behave in ways that were subtly but distinctly altered. Dr. Forrest, who had previously had a pleasant, easy manner with Clement at the occasional social gathering on the row, became careful, watchful, the kind of watchful that is not friendliness but its imitation. She looked at Miss Marple directly. And Francis Gale, who had always been the heartiest of Clement's acquaintances, the most demonstratively friendly, became, after August, quieter, more present. The kind of present that is not warmth but surveillance. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Miss Brid, she said, you have been extraordinarily helpful. I've been sitting on it for 2 months, Miss Brid said, waiting to see if I was wrong. I was not wrong. She looked at the cat. I'm sorry about Clement Adbury. He was a good man. He was a precise man, which is not always the same thing, but in his case it was. Yes, Miss Marple said. I believe so. Chapter 5. What Clement had remembered, and what his memory had cost him. Miss Marple spent Saturday evening at Violet's sitting room, in the comfortable chair by the fire, with her knitting and her thoughts, conducting the quiet internal work of assembling what she knew into the form it would need to take. She knew the following. Clement Adbury had written 3 letters in August. The letters had altered the behaviour of 3 recipients. Dr. Forrest had visited number 5 on Thursday afternoon with his medical bag. Francis Gale had arrived at number 5 on Saturday morning 20 minutes before he could have been notified of the death. A sweet-smelling liquid had been spilled on the greenhouse floor. The pipe had 3 drawers in it. The book was on the same page as 4 days before. She needed to know what was in the letters. For this, she needed to know what Clement Adbury had known. She went to see Mrs. Dorothea Adbury on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, and she went alone, which was the right way to go. Not with Inspector Stamp, not with Violet, but alone, as a woman calling on a widow in her grief, which is one of the forms of visit that requires no explanation and creates no alarm. Mrs. Adbury received her in the sitting room, dressed in black, composed in the particular way of a woman who's been composed through worse things than this and has the habit of it. She offered tea and Miss Marple accepted, and they sat for a moment in the comfortable, respectful silence of 2 women, in a room where someone is recently absent. You knew something was wrong, Miss Marple said after a moment. Not a question. Since August, Dorothea said. He wrote letters in August. He didn't tell me everything. Clement never told me everything, which was not unkindness. It was the way he had always been, the way of a man who carries things internally until he is certain of them. But he told me enough. He said he had become aware of certain matters concerning some of the neighbours, and had decided it was necessary to make them known. 3 letters, Miss Marple said. 3. Dorothea looked at her hands. 1 to Dr. Forrest, 1 to Francis Gale, and 1 to Mr. Carey at number 7, which I think Clement included less from certainty than from the feeling that he ought not to ignore what he knew. Did he tell you what he knew? Miss Marple asked. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. About Dr. Forrest. Not precisely. He said he had reason to believe that Dr. Forrest had done something professional that could not be defended. He said this with the expression he used when he was most certain of something and least willing to say it plainly. She paused. About Francis Gale. He was more specific. And he said he had seen, over 4 years of watching the way Francis Gale spent money, that the spending was inconsistent with the income, and that he had a memory, from his banking years, of a transaction in which a client of his had been seriously damaged, and that the solicitor's name in that transaction had been Gale. He said he did not know precisely what Francis Gale was doing, but that the pattern was one he had seen in banking, and that the pattern was not innocent. And he wrote to them, Miss Marple said. He asked for conversations, Dorothea said. He was always precise about this. He said he had not accused anyone of anything. He had asked for conversations. He believed that was the correct thing to do. It was the correct thing to do, Miss Marple said gently. It was also, I am afraid, not a safe thing to do. In that combination, correct and unsafe, there is always a particular risk. Dorothea looked at her. He was in danger, she said. I knew it. I told him in September that I was afraid. He told me I was being not foolish. He was never unkind. He told me he was confident that two reasonable men, faced with a clear statement of what was known, would choose the reasonable response. And they chose a different response, Miss Marple said. Yes, Dorothea said. They chose a different response. Her composure held with the visible effort of a woman who has been holding it since Saturday morning and intends to continue. Dr. Forrest came on Thursday. I brought them biscuits and left them in the greenhouse. I thought it was the conversation Clement had been waiting for. I thought it was the beginning of the reasonable response. She stopped. He was dead Saturday morning. Miss Marple sat with her for another hour, and then she went to find Inspector Stamp. Chapter 6. The Inspector is given what he needs. Inspector Ronald Stamp had spent Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning in the reluctant, professionally uncomfortable position of a man who's been told by a doctor that something is natural causes, and by an old lady that it is not, and who has to decide which of them to believe, and who has found, in the course of 20 years of investigative work, that old ladies are occasionally more reliable than doctors in situations of precisely this kind, and who finds this professionally uncomfortable to acknowledge. Miss Marple sat across from him in Violet's dining room on Sunday morning, and gave him what she had assembled with the unhurried, orderly precision she always used, beginning at the beginning, which was Violet's letter, and moving forward through each observation to its place in the sequence, giving each piece its proper weight, connecting each to the next with the patient logic of a woman who understands that a conclusion is nothing without the journey to it. She began with the greenhouse floor, the sweet-smelling liquid, which the county laboratory, working through Sunday on Inspector Stamp's urgent request, would confirm by Monday morning was a digitalis compound in a concentration approximately 4 times the therapeutic range. In a man with a documented cardiac condition, administered in warm tea in an afternoon greenhouse, it would produce the cardiac failure that Dr. Forrest had certified with such practiced, efficient sympathy. She moved to the pipe, 3 drawers in a man who smoked his pipe to the bowl every afternoon, to the book at page 47, the same page as 4 days before, to the indoor clothes of a man not planning garden work but an afternoon's reading, suggesting he had come to the greenhouse for his customary afternoon, not for any unusual reason. She moved to Dr. Forrest's Thursday visit, confirmed by Miss Eleanor Brid, confirmed by Miss Eleanor Brid, confirmed by the particular too-quick efficiency of his Saturday morning examination. She noted that Dr. Forrest had made the tea on Thursday, as was his habit when visiting, as Mrs. Adbury confirmed. He always said it was the least he could do, since Clement was providing the conversation. She noted that making the tea was the single critical moment, the 15 minutes in the greenhouse, alone with a man whose cardiac history he knew in exact detail, in which a preparation dissolved into a warm cup would begin its quiet, accumulating work. It would not act immediately, Miss Marple told the inspector. A digitalis compound of this kind, in this concentration, acts over 36 to 72 hours. Thursday afternoon, Saturday morning, the timeline is entirely consistent. Inspector Stamp wrote this down. And Gale? He asked. She moved to Francis Gale, to the Tuesday night crossing. Violet's figure over the garden wall at 11:30, in the number 5 garden for 20 minutes, back the same way. To the Saturday morning arrival, 20 minutes before he could have been notified. She had established this precisely, she told the inspector, because she had been at the gate with Violet when Mrs. Adbury found the body, and she'd noted the exact sequence. Mrs. Adbury to the constable's telephone, Mrs. Adbury to Violet's door, Gale at the number 5 gate within 20 minutes, constable arriving 2 minutes after Gale. He was told, Miss Marple said, not by Mrs. Adbury and not through any visible channel. He was told because he was part of the plan, not its agent but its architect, He needed to be first in the house because there was something in the house that needed to be first found by someone who could manage it. What thing? The inspector asked. That, Miss Marple said. I believe you will find in the letters Clement Adbury wrote in August. There should be drafts. Clement was the kind of man who kept drafts, in his desk in the study. She paused. And Francis Gale needed to be first in the house because a man of his particular kind, a solicitor involved in financial irregularities, who has commissioned one death already and arranged a second, always wants to know what documents exist. The inspector looked at her. Commissioned one death already, he said carefully. Mrs. Adbury's aunt, Miss Marple said. 3 years ago, 81 years old. Dr. Forrest was her physician. She had been intending to revise her will. She died before revising it. Francis Gale was her solicitor. She allowed a moment's silence. I learned from Miss Brid this morning that Mrs. Adbury's aunt had been, for the last 2 years of her life, a patient of Dr. Forrest's, and that the practice had recently changed hands, and that the previous physician, the one who had treated the aunt before Dr. Forrest, has retired to Dorset. He would, I think, be worth speaking to. Inspector Stamp looked at his notes. He looked at Miss Marple. He had the expression of a man who has been politely resistant to something for 48 hours, and has arrived, somewhat against his better judgment, at the position of being convinced. The laboratory report, he said. Monday morning, Miss Marple said. I believe it will confirm what I have told you, and when it does, I should think the priority will be Dr. Forrest's dispensary record. What he prescribed, to whom, in what quantities, rigor, and whether the quantities dispensed are consistent with the quantities prescribed. They won't be, Inspector Stamp said slowly. No, Miss Marple agreed. I don't believe they will. Chapter 7. 3 conversations, each turning something. Sunday afternoon produced 3 conversations, each of which turned a key in the case and made the lock's mechanism visible. The first was with Thomas Carey at the gate of number 7, whom Miss Marple found in his front garden doing the kind of purposeless, displacement activity gardening that people do when they are too agitated for inactivity and too agitated for anything productive. He was 37 and had the slightly over-careful manner she had observed from the beginning, the manner of a man conscious of making impressions, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, the manner of someone with a reason to be conscious of it. He had received Clement's letter, he admitted, when Miss Marple asked him directly, with the same pleasantly implacable directness she had always used in conversations of this kind. He admitted it in the flat, exhausted way of a man who's been holding something since August and finds, in the straightforward question of a white-haired elderly woman on a Sunday afternoon, the permission he has been looking for to set it down. The letter had told him that Clement had read a court report, that Clement had seen a photograph, that Clement wished for a conversation. Thomas Carey had not had the conversation, had avoided number 5, had avoided Clement, had spent 11 weeks in a state of anticipatory dread that had resolved Saturday morning into the sick, as complicated relief of a man who realizes the person he was dreading is gone, and is then immediately appalled at himself for feeling relief. He was kind about it, Carey said, with the slightly dazed quality of someone still surprised by this. The letter. He wasn't threatening. He said he had become aware of certain matters and wished to discuss them. He said he believed there might be explanations he was not in possession of. He paused. There weren't, of course, or there were, but not ones that would have satisfied him. No, Miss Marple said gently, but I think you will find, when this is concluded, that your situation is significantly separate from what happened to Clement. Your letter was a coincidence of timing, not a motive. Carey looked at her. Oh, he's dead because of the letters? He is dead because of what he knew, Miss Marple said. The letters gave form to the knowledge. But 2 specific people had reason to prevent the knowledge from becoming public, and it is those 2 people, not you, who made the decision they made. She left him looking somewhat less grey than when she'd found him. The second conversation was with Mrs. Ida Gale, Francis's wife, who received Miss Marple at the number 4 door with the bright, relentless social energy of a woman who has been maintaining the surface of her composure since Saturday morning with the specific intensity of someone who cannot allow it to develop cracks. She offered tea. She spoke about poor Clement and poor Dorothea with the correct warmth. She asked after Violet. She kept moving, small, neat, efficient movements, the constant activity of a woman for whom stillness is currently not possible. "Your husband was very quick to go to Mrs. Adbury this morning," Miss Marple said at one point, with the pleasant, conversational ease of a woman making a mild observation. "He heard," Ida said quickly. "He heard from—" She stopped. A fractional hesitation, the tiniest interruption in the relentless social energy. "I think Mrs. Perkins from the end of the row—" She stopped again. "I'm not sure, actually. News travels quickly on a street like this." "It does," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "On a street like this." She noted the hesitation and left. The third conversation was with Miss Eleanor Brid, who was in her kitchen making Sunday lunch with the methodical and self-sufficient pleasure of a woman who has been cooking for herself for 40 years and has long since made her peace with the arrangement. Miss Brid poured Miss Marple a glass of sherry without asking and said, "You've been busy this morning." "I have," Miss Marple agreed. "Miss Brid, you said yesterday that you know what happens on this street. I want to ask you something specific. Did you ever see Dr. Forrest call at number 4? At Francis Gale's house?" Miss Brid considered this with the methodical precision she brought to everything. 3 times, she said, in the past 3 years. Not for medical reasons, not with a medical bag, in the evening, after surgery hours. The visits were brief, an hour at most. The expression when he arrived was different from the expression when he left. When he arrived, the expression of a man going to something unpleasant. When he left, the expression of a man who has paid a bill. The expression of a man who has paid a bill, Miss Marple repeated quietly. "When you owe someone something," Miss Brid said, with the clear-eyed certainty of 7 decades of observation, "and you go to see them, you look like that when you leave. Like the account is slightly more settled than before, until the next time." She paused. "I saw it 3 times. It was never settled." Miss Marple finished her sherry and thanked Miss Brid, and walked back to number 3 through the grey October afternoon, and sat down with her knitting, and thought about the particular relationship of 2 men who have entered into a transaction in which one has done something irreversible at the other's request, and who are therefore bound together in the permanent mutual obligation of shared guilt, and how that relationship, once entered, produces only 2 available futures: continued silence, or the termination of whoever threatens it. Clement Adbury had threatened the silence. He had not known he was threatening anything. He had simply asked for conversations. It had been enough. Chapter 8. The Laboratory Report and the Arrest. The laboratory report arrived on Monday morning and confirmed, in the measured, precise language of scientific analysis, what Miss Marple had told Inspector Stamp on Sunday morning. The substance recovered from the greenhouse floor of number 5 Wisteria Row was a digitalis glycoside preparation, specifically a concentrated solution of digitoxin, in a quantity and concentration consistent with deliberate administration, rather than accidental spillage or ambient contamination. In a male subject of 58 with documented cardiovascular disease, the ingestion of the recovered quantity in a warm liquid drink would, with high probability, produce progressive cardiac failure within 36 to 72 hours, presenting symptoms indistinguishable on standard examination from naturally occurring cardiac arrest. Inspector Stamp read this report at 8 o'clock on Monday morning and drove to Wisteria Row at 8:30 with a sergeant, and the expression of a man who has spent the weekend being slowly convinced, and is now completely convinced and is prepared to act accordingly. He went to number 2 first. Dr. Hugh Forrest answered his own door in his morning coat, Gan already dressed for surgery, with the composed professional manner of a man who has been composing himself for 48 hours, and has it thoroughly in hand. He had it in hand for approximately 4 minutes, which was the time it took Inspector Stamp to produce the laboratory report and say, in the level, unhurried voice of a man not requiring a dramatic response, "Dr. Forrest, I have here the results of an analysis of a substance recovered from the greenhouse of number 5 Wisteria Row on Saturday morning. I should like to discuss it with you at the station, if you would be so good as to accompany me." Something in the composition failed, not dramatically, not with any of the expressions of guilt that detective fiction prefers, but with the specific, particular quality of collapse that occurs in very controlled people when the thing they have been controlling is finally and irrevocably named, a fractional loosening about the jaw, a slight increase of the quality of effort visible in the eyes. "I should like to telephone my solicitor," Dr. Forrest said. "Of course," Inspector Stamp said. Francis Gale was arrested 4 hours later, at his office in the town, on the basis of the financial documentation that the inspector's team had spent Monday morning extracting from the study of number 5, where Clement Adbury's draft letters and his meticulous, memory-based notes, written out in the weeks before his death, in a notebook he had placed at the back of his desk drawer under a false bottom of his own improvisation, provided the framework that the bank records, once subpoenaed, Husters would fill in completely. Miss Marple received the news of both arrests from Inspector Stamp by telephone at 1 o'clock on Monday afternoon. She thanked him, set down the receiver, and sat for a moment in Violet's hallway with the particular, quiet feeling she always had at this juncture. The feeling that is not satisfaction, precisely, and not triumph, but something closer to the relief of a weight set down correctly, of a thing returned to its proper place. Then she went to tell Violet, who was in the kitchen making lunch, and who received the news with the composed, relieved exhalation of a woman who has been holding her breath for 3 weeks. Chapter 9. What the Neighbours Never Told, and the Motor Back to St Mary Mead. Miss Marple spent Monday afternoon in a series of visits that were, in their nature, such the endings of things, the closing of conversations that the case had opened, the settling of the human remainder that official resolution always leaves behind. She sat with Dorothea Adbury for an hour in the number 5 sitting room, in the 2 chairs nearest the window that looked out onto the garden where Clement's roses were making their last October showing. A few stubborn blooms, deep red against the browning leaves, the persistence of growing things in declining conditions. He was right, Dorothea said at one point, about all of it. Everything he suspected was true. Yes, Miss Marple said. He was a precise man. Precise people, in my experience, are generally right about what they suspect. The difficulty is that they underestimate what happens to other people when they are found to be right. They assume that accuracy produces a rational response. It does not always. He thought asking for a conversation was the correct thing to do, Dorothea said. It was the correct thing to do, Miss Marple said. And it was not safe, because the people he was writing to had far more to lose than he had anticipated, and had already demonstrated, in the case of the aunt 3 years ago, that they were capable of responding to danger with something other than conversation. She paused. He did not know about the aunt. If he had known, I think he would have been more careful. He might have gone directly to the police, Dorothea said. He might have, Miss Marple agreed, though men of his kind rarely do. They prefer to resolve things themselves at the human level before bringing in authorities. It is a generous impulse. It is sometimes an expensive one. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. The notebook, she said. The inspector told me there was a notebook. In the back of the desk drawer, Miss Marple said, under a false bottom. He had made it himself, apparently, from a piece of thin board. The notebook contained everything he knew, written out in the weeks between August and his death. Everything he had remembered and everything he had subsequently confirmed. He knew he might not come out of it, Dorothea said. It was not quite a question. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that he understood, by October, that he had set something in motion that might not produce the result he had intended. The false bottom in the drawer, that is the action of a man who is keeping records for someone else to find. He was precise, Mrs. Adbury. He did not waste what he knew, she paused. He left everything necessary for what has happened today. Dorothea looked at the roses. He would have liked that, she said, very quietly. Miss Marple left her with the constable's reassurance that the legal processes would proceed with all appropriate speed, and she went to say goodbye to Eleanor Brid, who was in her garden in the October afternoon with her fork and her cat, and who received Miss Marple's departure with the dignified, unsentimental warmth of a woman who has lived alone for 30 years and has made peace with hellos and goodbyes. "Will you be called as a witness?" Miss Marple asked. "Your observations, the Thursday visit, the pattern of behaviour after August, they will want it on record." "I will be happy to provide it," Miss Brid said simply. "I should have provided it sooner. I observed and I sat on it, which is the thing one does on a street where observation is considered impertinent. It is not impertinent. It is the only instrument available to those of us who cannot do anything else." She paused. "I hope it is sufficient." "It is a great deal more than sufficient," Miss Marple said warmly. "You saw everything that mattered. You told it when it counted. That is exactly what is required of a witness." She went back to number 3 and packed her portmanteau and sat with Violet for half an hour before the motor came. Violet said, as she always did when Miss Marple was leaving, "You should come more often, under better circumstances." "I shall," Miss Marple said, "though I find, in my experience, that the circumstances tend to arrange themselves as they will." regardless of one's preferences in the matter. "Does this sort of thing happen wherever you go?" Violet asked, with the slightly awed quality of a woman encountering this particular fact about her friend for the first time at close range. Miss Marple considered this question seriously, as she always did when it was asked. "Not wherever," she said, "but one does find, if one pays attention, that things of this sort are happening rather more frequently than is generally supposed. They are simply not always noticed. People observe and then they sit on what they have observed for entirely understandable reasons, because they do not wish to appear melodramatic, because they are not certain, because they tell themselves it is not their business. And in the interval of sitting on it, the thing that required action has time to become irreversible." Violet was quiet for a moment. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "When I first saw it, I waited 4 days." "You told me when you could," Miss Marple said. "That is the way of it. The thing one sees sits with one until it has found the form in which it can be spoken. You found the form. You wrote the letter. Without the letter I would not have been here, and without being here I would not have been at the gate at 9:30 Saturday morning, and without being at the gate I would not have seen the greenhouse floor in the first 15 minutes, and without the greenhouse floor there would have been no sample and no laboratory report and no arrest." She paused. "Every consequential thing in this case was set in motion by your letter, Violet. By the decision to speak rather than continue sitting. The motor came at 4 o'clock. Miss Marple settled into the back seat with her portmanteau and her knitting, and the slight, comfortable stiffness of a woman who's been doing a great deal of walking on wet October pavements and is glad to be sitting in a warm motor. She looked out the window as the motor moved along Wisteria Row, the 7 Victorian houses with their solid brickwork and their privet hedges of 30-year authority, the gardens bare and tidy in the October afternoon, the curtains drawn against the early dark, the street presenting itself, as it always had, as a place where nothing of significance ever happened. She thought about what the neighbours never told, and what they had told in the end, and what that telling had accomplished. Violet's letter, which said the street did not feel like itself, which was the beginning of everything. Eleanor Brid's garden fork observations of 31 years, delivered with the plain, unhurried precision of a woman who has been waiting for someone to ask. Dorothea Adbury's careful account of August and what came after it, the history of a precise man's last months given to a precise woman who could use it. Thomas Carey's admission at the gate, the relief of 11 weeks' held breath released at last. Even Ida Gale's hesitation, that fractional pause in the relentless social composure, the smallest possible failure of the surface, had told its own truth. They had all seen something. They had all, for the various and entirely human reasons that make people reluctant to name what they see, not said it immediately. And then, one by one, they had found the form. They had told it when they could. Miss Marple thought that this was, in its way, enough. Not a comfortable thing, not a thing without cost, but enough. The truth had emerged. The record had been made. Clement Adbury had left a notebook in a false-bottomed drawer, and an elderly retired schoolmistress had written a letter to a friend, and between the two of them they had managed together what neither could have managed alone. The motor turned onto the road south towards St Mary Mead. The privet hedges of Wisteria Row diminished in the rear window, solid and 30 years tall, and then curved out of sight at the corner and were gone. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The October afternoon was the grey, damp, honest English grey of a season that makes no promises, and the road ahead was familiar and comfortable, and the needles clicked with the reliable sound of something ordinary being built, stitch by patient stitch, in the quiet of a moving motor. The end.